There wasn't much fighting going on in 1917, partly because the United States had to train its troops, equip them, draft them. All right, I got to say this about the draft. In both world wars, every man between 21 and 35 was expected to register for the draft. More than 4 million American men were put in uniform. Most of them did not get overseas because the war ended so quickly. Now, the Army would take you at 17 if you had your parents' consent. They would take you at 18. There was 18, 19, and 20-year-olds could go without their parents' consent. So they took volunteers as young as 17, and they took volunteers up to 45. So anywhere from 17 to 45. Now, farm workers were exempt because farm workers had to grow the food that the soldiers needed. Ministers, preachers were exempt. Students going to Christian schools to study to be a preacher were exempt. Priests were exempt. Rabbis were exempt. Few people that way were exempt, but most people between 21 and 35 registered for the draft and joined. The persons who didn't were looked on as being cowards, or a storekeeper would ask, hey, why aren't, if they saw there was a man in this age bracket, hey, how come you aren't in the Army? The men went to the Army. Now, if the Army has to be supplied with weaponry, the weaponry are made in factories, so women wound up running the factories, women and old men. Now, men over 46 and over, they worked at factories, but a lot of the factory work was done by women. This gave women more rights. Now, Woodrow Wilson was at first against giving women the right to vote. But then come the 1916 election, and Wilson saw he was facing a tough election. The Republican Party was united again. They had not been in 1912. Wilson realized if he wanted to get elected, he better change his mind, so he began to pursue giving women the right to vote. However, let me make it clear, women did not vote legally in 1916. They did in 1920. 1920 was the first election where that women actually voted. The amendment was the 19th Amendment. Anyway, women gained in status because they did a lot of the work. Also, women did a lot of the farm work, including farm work that used to be done by men. All right. The Germans eventually broke the trenches, and they got the French army, they broke through the French trench, got the French army running pell-mell from the battlefield. As the French soldiers were running, they bumped into the American soldiers who were behind the front line, and they told the Americans, "Get out, the war's over, the war's lost." An American made a famous reply, "We're not leaving, we just got here." So then the Americans advanced and engaged the Germans, and they stopped the German army cold. The battle was of two battles, the Second Battle of the Marne and the Battle of Chateau Thierry. Both battles were for the American soldiers. Now, here's something else I want to say about the Americans. Let's see, I don't think your book shows a picture of the famous picture of Wilson meeting with the other three European presidents, the President of France, the Prime Minister of Britain, and the President of Italy. Wilson was a much bigger man than the rest of them. The American soldier was bigger, noticeably larger than the European soldier. This was not so much due to better diet as it was due to the fact that the American soldier, his ancestry was more diverse than the ancestry of the European. Europeans were still marrying in their own community, and this tended to make them smaller than they would have been had they been marrying over the, whereas Americans, a French-American woman might marry an Italian-American man, and a Scottish-American man might marry a German-American woman, and Americans tended to marry strangers. Now, by stranger, I mean someone who neither their kith nor kin had ever heard of. My dad married a stranger. He was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and married a Kentucky girl. No one of his family ever heard of his wife, and no one of her family ever heard of him. In my case, I married a stranger. No one in my family ever heard of her, and no one in her family, I married a girl from Jacksonville, Florida. And I spent most of my childhood in the North. So basically, the Americans were marrying strangers, and this did a lot to make the American male and female both bigger than they would have been had they been marrying in their community for generations. Now I'm going to take this same logic and carry it a bit farther. If you wonder why more black men make the professional football teams and basketball teams than whites, it's because the black people's ancestry is more diverse than the ancestry of most whites. If that sounds racial, I'm sorry about it, but I mean, this is the way I see it. Now, if any of you want to have any, it's not that black is better than white, it's not that white is better than black. What's better is the mix. The offspring is oftentimes more bigger than their parent, than either parent. That's why some football players from a certain island in the Pacific have a lot of men make their the professional football team, because this island has been so isolated for so long. Then when another genetic pool comes in, namely Americans, their offspring are big enough to make a professional football team. All of you know that professional athletes get to play because they can beat everybody else out of their position. If you can play the game better than anybody else, these teams will hire you, whether you're white, black, Chinese. There's a Chinese man playing professional basketball right now, Jeremy Lin by name. They'll take anybody who can beat out anyone else out of their position. Again, diversity of your ancestry. That's the key. Boxing champs. We have one living right, a former champ living right here in Atlanta. A black man. Most of your boxing champs in my lifetime have been black, beginning with Joe Louis back in the 1930s. He was black. Most of your champs. All right, I mean, enough said about that. Anyway, all right. Again, folk, I once had a black girl listening when I made that speech, and she paused for a while, thought about it, then finally nodded her head. Yeah, she seemed to understand what I was saying. All right. Anyway, the American soldier was bigger than the German soldier, and the presence of the American on the battlefield was greatly demoralizing to the Germans. And also, Germany had been fighting the war for 4 years, and their men were really tired. The whole country was tired. All right. Anyway, after the Americans had fought a couple of big battles, if you read it in detail, the British took over the oil fields in Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. Oil had been discovered in 1905 in the Middle East, and the oil is still being pumped. That's how much oil there was. But the British got the oil fields, and the Germans simply ran out of gas. And even in 1918, that was enough to make the Germans forced to surrender. That meant their trucks couldn't move, their tanks couldn't move, their planes couldn't get off the ground, their officers could not move around. They were out of gas, literally. Their armies began to retreat all over the field, and finally the German high command said, "We don't have a chance." They knew the Americans had 2 million men already in uniform fighting against them, with another 2 million in training, and possibly another. They said to each other, well, if we could handle these 2 million who are over here, they're going to send 2 million more. We can't handle them. Yeah. And finally one of them said to the other, I think we have to surrender. Yeah, they did. The surrender occurred on what is a day called Armistice Day, or it was once called Armistice Day. Today it's called Armed Services Day, but it was originally called, it's on November 11th. On the 11th month and the 11th day of the 11th hour, Germany surrendered. 11th month, 11th day, 11th hour, 1918. Not the 11th year, though. Anyway, November 11th, and from that day to this, now we once celebrated because we thought it was the war to end all wars. We now celebrate it because we want to honor our servicemen. And having been a serviceman myself once, I can go take my paperwork to show there was any Army once and get a free meal at some of the restaurants. I call it free, but by the time I take my wife and daughters or family with me, it's expensive. So what a free meal winds up costing 20 or 30 bucks, but that's something else. But anyway, something one of the benefits you can get if you've served, folk. All right. Anyhow, they do this on November 11th, sometimes on the 12th or 13th. Some of these restaurants would give servicemen or former servicemen a free meal. Anyway, November 11th, that's how we celebrate it. The war ended. All right. Now, in the meantime, in America, trade with Germany was stopped, but also a lot of Germans were killed, lynched, purely for the crime of being German. Germans were harassed. They did not retaliate because they knew they did not have a chance to win. It was a terrible time for Germans living in the country. And in World War II, we wound up interring Japanese also and putting them in camps. We'll talk more about that later. Folk, now here's for your book. And I mean, I'm going to tell you, from this point on, you're going to find me disagreeing with the authors more and more. In time of war, folk, you have to curtail your freedoms. Most of you probably won't agree with that. But during the Vietnam War, we allowed the college students to riot and protest, and we lost. The enemy was greatly encouraged by the protesting they saw on our college campuses. We lost. Every country that was involved in World War I, including Britain and France, curtailed freedoms. Every country. Eugene Debs, the socialist, was jailed because he said that we didn't have a reason to go to war. Wilson gave him 10 years in prison. Well, the courts gave him 10 years in prison. But the next president, Harding, commuted his sentence. He only served about a year or two. Harding commuted his sentence in 1921. He should have served about 7 more years. He would have. There were several examples. Now, I'm going to give something on the way of a personal example. I'm not going to call the name of the church, but I grew up in a church that encouraged its members to become conscientious objectors. My dad wanted us to become conscientious objectors. I did not follow that route. Neither did another one of my brothers. One brother joined. I joined. Another brother is still a conscientious objector to this day. But this church was investigated by Wilson, and some of its members were harassed because they encouraged their people to not join the army and fight. Again, this happened. People like that were called cowards. Laws were passed to curtail freedoms. I've got to say this, folk, about freedom of speech. I've not mentioned this to either of my classes until now. I mean, I've not mentioned it to the classes this semester. I have mentioned before. There is no freedom of speech. Your speech will determine, if you're a politician, whether you get elected or whether you don't. If you're on a job, your speech will determine whether you stay on the job or whether you get a promotion or whether you don't. Your speech determines whether you have friends or whether your friends leave you, whether you can attract people or repel them. Your speech can even determine whether you go to jail or not. And every day you listen to somebody said something that is politically incorrect and he brings the whole country down on him. You can't say what you think in this world today. You can't say what you want to. There are too many restraints on freedom of speech these days. You can be sued for exercising what you think is your constitutional right to free speech. Free speech does not exist. If any of you want to contest that, the floor is open. Anybody? Nobody? Most of you appeared to be listening. I appreciate that. Most of you seemed like you were listening to what I was saying, but nobody wants to contest it. Maybe you know that what I'm saying is pretty well true.
It's true because the president is getting away with all his free speech.
Somebody say, what is it?
I said it's true because the president is getting away with all his free speech.
Well, okay. Everybody is taking away everybody else's free speech. You got in this world, you got to be really careful what you say. All right. Now, when the war ended, Woodrow Wilson did something that had not been done by any president before him while in office. Now, other presidents had gone across the Atlantic either before or after. Jefferson went across the Atlantic before he got to be president. So did Adams. And Grant made a trip around the world after his term of 8 years as president were over. But Woodrow Wilson was the first president to cross the Atlantic while in office. He crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Now, we did have one president. Roosevelt went to Latin America while in office. But no president crossed the Atlantic while in office until Wilson did. Now, folk, this was a huge mistake on Wilson's part. A leader must know to delegate authority. And this was especially critical in this case. Wilson went to Europe, went to France to negotiate the end of the war, and he made another mistake. He took only Democrats with him. That was sad because in the election of 1918, which was an off-year election, the Republicans gained control of both House and Senate. Now, everyone could understand if if Wilson would have taken 6 Democrats and 5 Republicans, or if he had taken 4 Democrats and 3, he should have taken more Democrats and Republicans, but he should have included Republicans to make his efforts bipartisan. He didn't. As it was, he turned the whole Republican Party against him, and by this time the Republicans were in the majority, and Wilson did not realize it. Another thing, though, about delegating authority, every leader should delegate authority. If Wilson would have appointed an ambassador and said to the ambassador, you go to Europe and you tell them you want thus and such, if it would have backfired, supposing the ambassador would have said something would have backfired, Wilson could have said, oh, wait, that's the ambassador, that was not my instructions, fired that ambassador, replaced him with somebody else, and everything would have gone smoothly. But being the president, if he said something that offended the people, guess what? He couldn't say this was not my official policy. The other countries sent ambassadors. That way the leaders were kind of at the top free. It's something that if any of you become president, you learn most of the time you send ambassadors. And that way if your politics goes south or goes sour, you can blame it on the ambassador, replace him with another one. Wilson didn't do this. He had negotiated himself. The other people at the negotiating table were ambassadors. He was the leader of the country. Again, he shouldn't have done it. But he presented at the Paris Peace Conference 14 points. These 14 points, some other thing, gave democracy to the peoples who didn't have it, particularly the persons who were under control of Germany before the war. They called for abolishing tariffs, free trade, abolishing secret treaties, reducing armaments. So this was something that's become an issue from that era. Reducing armaments, and recognizing the rights of colonial peoples. All this, but the point number 14 was that there should be a League of Nations. Where the nations could sit down and talk over their differences and solve their differences peacefully. The idea seemed great, but Wilson found out that, once there he was looked on as being naive. The European people saw things in a different light. The European victors wanted to blame Germany and wanted to make Germany pay for the cost of the war. And, folk, this was something that Germany simply could not afford to do. Now, in contrast, folk, when World War II ended, the United States went in to rebuild Italy, rebuild Germany, rebuild Japan. Those nations have not gone to war with us since. But the European countries wanted to punish Germany. One general looked over the Treaty of Versailles and said, this is not a peace treaty, this is merely a 20-year truce. He's remembered because of he is so accurate 20 years later, Europe was back at war again. But again, if Wilson's advice had been followed, perhaps World War II might have been averted. But Wilson made his mistake in not realizing the temperament of the, just like he didn't realize the temperament of the Latin American people, he did not realize the temperament of the European people either. They wanted Germany to pay, they wanted Germany to be punished, they wanted Germany to take all the blame for starting the war, and Wilson had to compromise because he saw he was outnumbered. Well, Wilson came home. Your book says that many of the world's problems today have their origin right at that peace conference. The trouble in the Middle East can be traced back to the peace conference. Let's see. Well, the trouble in Vietnam, again, can be traced back to that peace conference. The trouble we had later in Vietnam. A lot of the world's problems were not met, when the needs were not solved, when maybe those people had an opportunity to solve that they did not realize they had. Well, Wilson expected that his treaty would get instant ratification. Now, the Constitution says the president makes treaties, but the treaties have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. All right, here is the problem. When Wilson presented the Treaty of Versailles, which included the League of Nations to the Senate did not ratify it. Why? Well, okay, all right. Baseball season started 2 days ago. It's been said that every team is going to win 60 games. Every team is going to lose 60 games. It's what you can do with the other 42 games to determine whether you're a success or not. Wilson had some votes he was going to have an easy time getting. He had some votes he could never get. There were people in the Senate who were staunch, convinced isolationists who said the United States is never going to get involved in a European treaty organization. The United States will never get involved in another European war. We will not ratify this no matter what. But then there was another group of senators who said to Wilson, most reasonably, Mr. Wilson, we'll vote for it, but you left out something we think is important. We feel like that we in the Senate should have the power to oversee what you do with this treaty, that we should, because the Constitution says, if you'll just simply modify it to where the Senate gets to look over your shoulder or the Senate gets to approve or disapprove of your actions, we'll ratify it. Wilson refused. Well, one of the books I've read said that Wilson had suffered a series of strokes. And these strokes had made him really, really a hard man to change his mind. That he once convinced of that he was right, he would not change, and folk, this is not the way to be. In a democracy, you have to be willing to compromise. Wilson was unwilling to compromise, but something else. Wilson grew up with a father who was a predestinated, I'm not going to call it the name of the church he was a preacher in, but his father was a preacher. On a personal note, my father was a preacher, and he grew up in the same type of background, where that you can't convince him to change. You can sometimes know that he's wrong and try to tell him he's not going to budge, he's not going to move. I grew up with that myself. So did Mr. Wilson, grew up with the same thing. And he became just like his daddy was. I don't change, I don't move. Well, hey, I'm not talking about myself here. I mean, I think I do change, and I do. And if I find out my family wants me to do something else, I'll try to accommodate them. Wilson wouldn't. Now, folk, you'll not find this in any history book. This is just me talking. I think that something else that had a lot to do with why the Senate did not approve of Wilson had to do with the Bible. A lot of persons in wartime will become very, very religious. A lot of persons who never attended church before start attending. I mean, I recall on September 11th occurred on Tuesday of 2001, occurred on Tuesday. On Wednesday, September 12th, the churches were as packed out as they would have been on Easter Sunday. This was a Wednesday night service, and every church in town was packed out. Where were they during the, anyway, that's another story. All right. These people started reading your Bibles, and they read about end-time prophecy. And if any of you know anything at all about end-time prophecy, it calls for about three things. At the end of time, there'll be a huge war, there'll be a great plague, and there'll be an Antichrist, and there'll be a covenant. Covenant, that was the key word that kept these people. They said, we don't want to get involved in any kind of covenant because this could entangle us with a future Antichrist. Now, again, you won't find this, but I believe this had a lot to do with it. Now, what about the Great Plague? It was a great influenza plague of 1918 that only lasted 4 months or so, but it killed 40 million people, 700,000 of them were Americans. The plague of 1918, and we don't know what it was because the microscope had not, the electron microscope had not been invented. And we could not see viruses. The virus was not discovered until 1930. The flu is caused by some virus, but we don't know what it was, except we know it could hardly be cured. Woodrow Wilson got the plague himself, but he recovered. The King of Spain got it, and he died. On a personal note, my grandmother's brother, Uncle Green, got it, and he died. And his picture was sitting on a wall till the day she died. And I'd see it every time I visited. There was Uncle Green sitting there with his guitar. He had died in the plague. Now, he was a soldier in the army, but he died in a plague after the war was over. Great influenza outbreak. Now, I need to take roll. I noticed absenteeism was high in my first class and looks like it'll be high in this class. One of my wife's friends took his wife to the hospital, emergency. They couldn't keep her there because too many people didn't even have beds for them. They were even putting people in the hall. I'm talking about March 2019 now. What's the reason? Influenza. This is in 2019 now. My wife told me this just yesterday. Happened a couple days ago. Anyway, we can handle it better than they could. But between war, the war at that time was the worst war in history. The plague, the worst plague we'd ever had. I think that had a lot to do with Mr. Wilson not getting his treaty across. All right.